Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come warm yourself by the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Carlos Cagina is the technical producer. Ryan White is the live stream producer, and we're live streaming this radio program in two places, actually. My YouTube channel, Strange Planet, and my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. Just a programming note, next week's show, which will take place on Boxing Day, will be a repeat program from December 26, 2012. I'm going to dial back 9 years with guest host Victor Vigiani, and in the first hour, the Star of Bethlehem, as Christian lore has it, guided three wise men to a site in a Judean town where a newborn child of significant eminence lay in a construct that sheltered animals. Tradition says they came to hail the birth of a new king, an exceptional child conceived in unique circumstances, born under exceptional circumstances with a star, no less, for a designated guiding light that brings special visitors with special behests to see him. All this accompanied by apparitions and space-wide manifestations, a real magic show for all to see and hear in a little significant town 2,000 years ago. What other so-called inexplicable magic show that goes on today bears a natural reference to all this in terms of its spectacle and wonder? Yes, you've guessed it, the UFO phenomenon. Victor and UFO expert Nigel Kerner will discuss in the second hour who actually were the Magi, kings or scientists, and what was the celestial phenomenon we're told the Magi followed in the sky? Why was Mary chosen to be the mother of Jesus? Father Richard Gaius will examine the role played by King Herod in the highly politicized world in Judea before and after Christ's birth. So that's next week with special guest host Victor Vigiani as we dial back to December 26, 2012 for that one. All right, settle in, friends. We are going to talk giants for the next 2 hours. There are giants among us, passing largely unnoticed, intent on carrying out a secret plan to enslave all humanity. They may not look like giants today, but their bloodlines extend all the way back to the Nephilim, the offspring of angels who mated with human women, described in Genesis 6 when giants roamed the land. Gary Wayne details the role of modern-day Nephilim in Satan's plan to install the Antichrist at the end of days, when God cast the angel Lucifer and his followers out of heaven. Lucifer set into motion a scheme to ensure the Nephilim survived. Why? Because from the bloodlines of these Nephilim and the Antichrist will come. To keep his plan alive, Satan has enlisted the loyalty of secret societies such as the Freemasons, the Templars, and the Rosicrucians to conspire in teaching a theology and a history of the world that is contrary to the biblical one. This Genesis 6 conspiracy marches toward the Great Tribulation when the loyalty of the terminal generation, this generation, will be tested. The Bible, along with many other ancient sources, clearly records the existence of giants. Gary Wayne is here to provide copious citations from many society insiders, along with extensive Bible references, other religious references, and historical material to bolster his connection. Gary's a Christian contrarian who's maintained a lifelong love affair with biblical prophecy, history, and mythology. His extensive study has encompassed the Bible and Gnostic scriptures, the Qur'an, the Bhagavad Gita, Gilgamesh, and other ancient epics, language, etymology, and secret society publications. The Genesis 6 conspiracy, how secret societies and the descendants of giants plan to enslave humankind, is his seminal work. Gary Wayne, welcome. So who was the leader of this band of 200 rebellious angels that landed at Mount Hermon?
Yeah, biblically we don't get the name in the Bible, but the book of Enoch talks about an angel named Azazel or Shemiaza as the leader of these 200 who swore the oath on Mount Hermon to carry out the deeds that they had planned together to do. And typically people think that maybe Shemiaza is the leader, and typically some people think Azazel is the leader. What generally seems to be the case is that somewhere before the time of the Book of Enoch was written down and and translated down through other languages, so that we don't have a original copy of the Hebrew scripture, you have a splitting of the name of Shemiaza and Azazel. They tend to be, from what most researchers look at, as being the same angel that has been named twice, and seemingly having the same sort of responsibilities and things in the book of Enoch. And typically an angel's name ends in El, as in Azazel. And Shemiaza is kind of a combination of a few words that comes out of a few other religions. So you've got, it's kind of like a Z word, the Yaza part, and Shem goes back to the Shemayim in Hebrew, and renowned. And so it's almost like a title that's been added in there. So make the story short on that aspect, I would say Azazel is the name, and Shemiaza might be a title as he's known in other cultures.
And so is Shemiaza, is he Satan or Lucifer?
Not again, in the book of Enoch, we get Satan as a separate individual, and we also get Satans that are plural. And these Satans, they answer to Satan in the book of Enoch. So they would be lower down on the rank. So if you can imagine the pantheon of gods around the world, and they generally have 7 in that pantheon who are represented by, sort of the local planets that we have, and also the sun, not the sun, and the moon as well. And Satan would be the 8th, and so he's above that pantheon. So the Satans, and that would include Azazel, would be like his lieutenants, like his generals, his leaders of all of the other rebellious angels. So if you can imagine, the host of heaven is an army of angels, and the host, as that goes back to Hebrew, is the Hebrew word Saba. And Saba means an army. So there's an army with rank and hierarchy and different orders. And one needs to imagine whether or not it's the loyal angels or the rebellious angels and the gods having that same kind of hierarchy that they would have within their specific armies.
And so, again, the angels that landed at Mount Hermon, what order of angels were they before they were cast out for rebelling? What was their function? What was their job?
Well, you have many, many angels, so there's more than just the 200. And Revelation 12 actually talks about this war of angels. And earlier on in Revelation, and also in the book of Daniel, we're told the number of angels around the throne is 10,000 times 10,000, which is basically 100 million. So even if that is an allegorical number, it is a significant number. But taking it literally, if a third of them, as Revelation 12 discusses, they would have been at least 33 million. So you've got a lot of angels, and you've got different sort of ranks and orders. So the ones that most people reference when it comes to the creation of the giants are the Watchers. And the Watchers show up in Daniel 4 times biblically, and it's a Hebrew word, Air, for meaning watcher. And those are thought to be the seraphim watchers that are around the throne, both in the Bible and the book of Enoch. So the Watchers are the ones who are always awake and always watching, and that includes 4 groups. One is the archangels, one is the Ophanim, one is the cherubim, and the other one is the seraphim. It's the seraphim that tend to be the ones that are thought to be the Watchers, who provide governance over the earth and the religious aspect of the civilizations that seem to be the ones that initially decided that they were going to create the giants and swore the oath on Mount Hermon. So typically we understand this as being the seraphim angels. And they were the fiery serpent-faced angels with 6 wings.
So they decided, they swore an oath that they were going to take the daughters of men and create these hybrid creatures, the Nephilim, who were the giants. How did they take the women? Was it by force? Was it through trickery? Were deals struck, in other words, in exchange for technology? How was this achieved?
How was it achieved? How? I didn't quite understand the question.
Well, the angels, did they take the women by force?
Okay, yes,
Were their marriages arranged? Was there an exchange of technology?
You get a couple of different versions. One is that the women were attracted to the fallen angels, but typically how the wording is placed, whether it's in the Book of Enoch or in the Bible, is they took any that they chose. So that meant they were the ones that were in charge, the angels, and they took as many women as they chose to bed and to create these giants, which biblically would be known before the flood as the Nephilim. So one would not expect that it was a symbiotic relationship. Maybe the women didn't mind. Maybe they objected. We're not told, but the language suggests that they didn't have a choice.
So giving birth to a giant, I'm guessing, led to death in each and every occasion, would it? I mean, I would imagine if you're going to give birth to a creature of that size, I mean, they're not full size, of course, when they come out, but did it always end in death for the women?
Yeah, one would expect the babies would be of extraordinary size as well. And so biblically, we're not told. In the Book of Enoch, we're not told. But what is interesting in a book that is based on the Old Testament that was written down by the Ethiopians in terms of a Judaic sect in the Kebra Nagast, it said that all of the babies were born because of their size through a cesarean operation that caused all of the mothers to die. But biblically, or from other sources that talk a lot about the giants, we really don't find that out. And in the Book of Enoch, though, what's interesting, it says about the mothers who produced the giants. They turned into a kind of a demon, and they are the sirens, which is sort of the root to the mermaid mythology. So when you talk about sort of a demon being, you're talking about a spiritual being that would be the spirits of the human females that would have been cursed for creating these, what the Book of Enoch talks about, the violations against the laws of creation, and are sentenced to sort of roam the earth as these demon kind of spirits called sirens.
And with these Nephilim, were they equal? Well, they were part human, they were part angel, but did they have a conscience? I mean, or were they pure evil? Were they conflicted?
Well, I think they all had a choice, right? Everybody that's on this earth today, or in history, or in prehistory, they're born with free choice, just as the angels had free choice to be loyal or not, just as we have a choice to believe what we want to do and follow who we want to follow. So they would have had that choice as well. They would have had the immortal spirit of the fallen angels, and they would have had these extraordinary sized bodies and probably some extraordinary gifts that went along with that. But they would have had a choice to be good or evil. And in a lot of polytheist cultures, you actually get this sort of dualism in terms of whether or not they were good or evil. So if you go into, let's say, the Greek mythology, for instance, you have Hercules or Theseus or Perseus, who are offsprings of the gods and a human female, and were understood in ancientology as demigods, as that definition, the offspring of a god and a human female. These were heroes and earthly titans. And just as Poseidon created 12 Nephilim kings, or titan or hero kings, from his cohabitation with Cleito to create the 10 kings for the Atlantean Empire, you have ones that are good and ones that are evil, and one presumes that they chose to either be beneficial to humankind or not, but they ruled, and they were all sort of leaders of humans, whether it was good or it was evil. Typically, most of them tended to be evil, or became evil because of their hubris, because of their great strength, because of their great size, and their ability just to dominate humans. These weren't just tall. I mean, they were called giants for a reason, and the size was absolutely, incredible when we look at, the comparatives between what a human would be or what a giant would be. And before the flood, the giants were thought to be, 20 to 40 feet tall. And some accounts might suggest that they were even larger than that. They're a little bit smaller than that after the flood, but these were incredibly huge beings. And so one can imagine that not only were they big, but they were aggressive, and they were fleet of foot, and they were sort of the ultimate warrior. So it kind of follows that a lot of them would develop some arrogance and some hubris. And once they cross that threshold, then they turn into oppressors of humankind. Even though there might have been a few giants that were trying to protect humans, by the time the flood comes, they are destroying humankind en masse, and they are controlling all of the governments.
So by virtue of having Nephilim blood, that wouldn't exclude you from salvation, though, technically, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Some people say that. I don't think so. I think we're all here with free choice, and that if you receive, whether or not it would be a bloodline or genes, or if you're the offspring, you still have free choice. And in the Christian belief, which I'm a Christian, all the sins of the world are forgiven except for violations against the laws of creation. But still, these beings would have had a choice, whether or not they wanted to make that choice, whether or not they had hearts that were hardened. They still had a choice, and depending on what they did and who they followed, then they in turn would be saved through the sacrifice of Christ. Now, I know a lot of people may tend to disagree with me on that, but I do believe in that sort of principle of free choice. The thing that you have to remember, though, about these Nephilim, though, is it's not likely they were followers of God. They may have done some good things, but they would have been followers of the pantheon. And as a polytheist, then even if they do good things, you're typically not going to be saved through the sacrifice of Christ, except as the book of Romans talks about, there will be those who weren't able to become in contact with Jesus's teachings and aware of who he was and what a sacrifice. Then they'll be judged as to what they did based on what was in their hearts. So if they were doing things in their hearts and for good all of the time, then that's the standard they would be judged against. So,
all right, Gary, we'll take a quick time out and come back and continue to discuss giants. Gary Wayne, the author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. Back with more in a moment. Don't go away.
Fasten your behind on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
Hey, welcome back. Gary Wayne is here, author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. So we had giants in Canaan, but how do we explain the legends of giants in the New World and elsewhere around the world? Are they connected?
Well, and even more is how do giants show up after the flood? So that you have this flood that's designed to wipe them out, but yet biblically we get giants in Canaan, as you talked about, And also we have giants that show up all around the world, not just in North America, but all around the world, both before and after the flood. So when we look at the giants in North America, they tend to be connected back to the ones in Canaan. So if we sort of start there and come forward, I'll make those connections. And the giants can only really sort of show up after the flood in a couple of ways. That somehow they survived, whether or not it's through the gods and the fallen angels, in the earth, off the earth, on an ark somehow, or there's a second creation after the flood. And it doesn't really matter. I tend to fall, though, into a second incursion. And these are giants that are called the Rephaim after the flood, as opposed to the Nephilim before the flood. And they're giants as well. They're thought not to be quite as large, but these are the post-Diluvian giants. They tended to be both before and after the flood, which means there's a connection, whether, so again, they could survive or be recreated. They tended to have red hair, pale skin, pale white skin, and either hazel eyes or blue eyes. And the North American giants tend to be red-haired, and of course with the elongated skulls that the giants also had. Same with the Peruvian skulls that they find with the elongated skulls. They're associated with the red hair. So it seems likely that there's a source that would come that would predate the North American and the South American giants, and seemingly would connect back to Canaan and the Middle East. There was some research that was done in the last few years where they've taken some of the sampling out of the Peruvian skulls and they kind of linked them back into Scotland and the Tuatha De Danann and back into the Scythians, which are connected people, because that's where the Tuatha De Danann come from after the flood. And those seem to be the same beings that were also migrated into the Canaanite land as aboriginals very shortly after the flood. So I think they're kind of connected on that.
So you mentioned that the Rephaim were smaller in stature than the first several generations or pre-flood giants. Is that because they intermingled with humans, and so gradually, through intermarrying and so forth, or crossbreeding, if I can use that, that's a rather crass term, is that what ultimately led to the giants becoming smaller and smaller?
Ultimately, that had the biggest thing to why there's such a reduction in size over time. And for some reason, and particularly in accounts like the Ugaritic text where it talks about the Rapiu, which are the Rephaim, is they were having a fertility problem. So you combine a fertility problem and an issue of intermarriage in too small of a circle of bloodlines, and you also will get blood disease. So they were kind of forced to bring in human populations, generally females, but in some cases males, to produce hybrid humans as offspring. And as that sort of continued down through the generations, you would get that dilution in terms of size and in the features as to what they would have looked like. And we get sort of an indication of this in a couple passages in the Bible that they were indeed intermarrying. In the Genesis 36, you have Eliphaz, who is the son of Esau and the brother of Jacob, who is the patriarch for the Israelites. His son Eliphaz marries, or his son Eliphaz is the son of Esau. Eliphaz marries a Horim, who is a Rephaim as well. It's a different tribe of the Rephaim, and also with pale skin and red hair. And hazel eyes is typically how they're described. She marries Amalek, or marries Eliphaz and produces Amalek, and produces the Amalekites that people are probably familiar with from the Bible. And they were hybrid humans from a female source. In the book of Genesis, also in Genesis 10 with the Canaanites, you have 3 patriarchs that are listed. You have Canaan, who has 2 sons, Sidon and Heth. And then you have 9 patriarchless families of Canaanites, and families can go back to, as it goes back to Hebrew, can mean either family, so it also means species, a different kind, a different race, and depending on the narrative that it's in is how you're going to define that. But they don't have a specific patriarch, as all the other nations that are counted at 70 in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles, they all have a patriarch except for this 9. Giants don't tend to have a patriarch in the Table of Nations. So the Anakim, which are also biblically documented as giants, and that word giant goes back to Rapha, and the male plural is I am for the Rephaim, is another tribe of the Rephaim. And the patriarch for the Anakim, his name is Arba, as we're told in the book of Joshua, and Arba is not listed in the Table of Nations. So we get this sort of anecdotal information that there was this intermarriage to create these hybrid humans that weren't as large as the Rephaim, but still taller than the average, let's say, Israelite at that time. That would have been somewhere between 5 to 5.5 feet or so. The Egyptians called these hybrids the Shazu, and they were typically 7 to 9 feet tall. And when Moses sent spies and scouts into the land of Canaan to bring back a report of the land, they brought back a report of 2 different kinds of people. One were the Anakim kings, and the 3 kings that were mentioned were Talmai, Ahiman, and Sheshai. And they also mentioned people that are stronger and taller, which included people like the Amalekites and like the Canaanites and like the Amorites. And these are nations that were hybrid nations. And in Deuteronomy 1, which does a sort of a recap on this 40 years later, as Israel is about to march on Canaan and into the land of the Rephaim and the hybrids, Moses recaps the story and actually says that there were the Anakim there, and the other people were taller than the Israelites. So I think we get those kinds of peoples that are intermixing and producing that hybrid human race that are still significantly taller than the humans. We don't get a lot of dimensions in the Bible in terms of the size of the Rephaim after the flood. The only 2 references that we would have would be 400 years later would be the best example, would be with Goliath, who was also a son of a giant, as with 4 other brothers, as the son of the same giant from Gath, the city of Gath, the Philistine city. And that's the word giant again, which is Rapha and Rephaim. So it could be that that father's name was Rapha as a patronymic name, or it's just going back generically as the Rephaim and the plural thereof. He is 6 cubits and a span. And typically the giants are kings. So a cubit is generally 18 inches as a common, but a royal cubit would be 21 inches. So Goliath would have been 9 feet 9 inches tall to about 11 feet 3 inches tall, depending on how you want to measure that cubit. So no matter what, he's at least twice the size. And they also were thought to have a height to width ratio that was 50% larger, as in stockier, as what the humans were. So they were built like wrestlers, like WWF wrestlers or linemen. They just weren't these tall, skinny giants. These were strong, fleet of foot warriors. And the other reference would be Og's bed, and he's a king, and he's a Rephaim. He's the last of the original Rephaim, as he's depicted 3 times biblically. And his bed was basically 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So he's going to be somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall, and he's going to be somewhere between 4 to 5, maybe even 6 feet wide. And so that bed was made of iron, not wood, because it wouldn't have held his weight. And they kept that bed as a representation of the size of Aga in a city called Rabbah for a very long period of time. And Josephus makes reference to these, to the bones of the giants that the Israelites killed, that they were of a completely different bioengineering and different sort of framework to hold that kind of size and weight. So when we talk about the different kinds of beings that come from the intermarriage, all of this is taking place in the early post-Diluvian world.
All right, Gary, another time out, back with more of our conversation. The Genesis 6 conspiracy. We're talking giants for the full 2 hours. Don't go away. Here's a resolution for 2021. Reduce stress and enhance your immune system. ESS 60 from C60 Evo. C60 is the carbon 60 molecule known to deliver more than 172 times the power of vitamin C. 172 times. ESS 60 is the purest form of C60, a known antiviral, antibacterial, and anti-inflammatory remedy that works. ESS 60 neutralizes free radicals from cell metabolization and external toxins to help minimize inflammation and maximize detoxification. Further, people report better sleep, more energy, and renewed mental clarity when they take our ESS 60 organic oil. To order your miracle molecule ESS 60, go to c60evo.com/Richard-Serrett. c60evo.com/Richard-Serrett. Buy now and save 10% by using the coupon code EVRS at checkout. Again, use the coupon code EVRS at checkout.
Fasten your seatbelt and put your tray in the upright position. You're about to leave everything you know behind on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
Gary Wayne stays with us, the Genesis 6 conspiracy. We're talking giants for the full 2 hours. Did the Nephilim have, and their descendants, did they have any supernatural abilities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a lot of people think that they did, and particularly perhaps a changeling quality. We don't really get any evidence of that, but obviously the angels, to take a physical body in the physical universe, they would have had to change from a spirit being into a physical being, and to be able to produce DNA to produce offspring. So there's that possibility, but we don't get that as a superpower. But what we do get is that these giants had super strength and super speed, and some were thought to be, highly intelligent as well. Although again, there's debate as to whether or not that's accurate or not. But we're not given sort of that hard, tangible evidence there. I think one has to be open-minded that that might be the case, but again, we really don't have that. They tended to have a bank of knowledge that assisted them, and that's where some of the powers sort of, I think, come into play. And so in the organizational structure of their dynasties and the kingdoms and the noble elite, which would have been the Nephilim and the Rephaim after the flood, they would have also had those same bloodlines and sort of larger family that controlled the priesthood. And in the priesthood, they developed the knowledge that was given from the gods and was developed in the 7 sacred sciences before the flood, that merged to really develop technology that starts to explain some of the things that you might see coming out of the antediluvian world, whether or not, and the most obvious would be the megalithic structures, whether it's a city like Machu Picchu or the pyramids or all of these underground cities and things that you see around the world, that they had the technology that we don't have today. And within that knowledge is the magical arts. And of course, art is just another word for science in the ancient world. And so they were developing all of these different sciences to do things that we're just starting to tap into today. And I think that would have been the source of that sort of additional power that they had, because they developed extraordinary weapons and things like that. So, but physical attributes in terms of that type of superpower, we don't really get that in terms of, even in the polytheist mythologies, it's typically their weapons that are sort of unique, and that comes out of that bank of knowledge.
Getting back to the physical characteristics, where we often think of giants having an extra digit on each hand, each toe, a second row of teeth. Is that true?
It is in some, not all, but it is something that does show up, and we actually get biblically an account of 6 digits on each hand of one specific giant in the time of Goliath, and but from physical other attributes, they would have taken on the look of their procreators, of the fallen angels. So when we look at depictions that are in the antediluvian civilizations and the early post-diluvian civilizations, most of the gods are serpentine, which are like seraphim angels. It would be akin to the Nagas in India, the dragon creator gods in China. You would have the feathered serpents and the plumed serpents like Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec religion, and similar types of gods throughout the Incas and all through Central and South America and North America. You have the same type of gods, and they're all serpentine with these 6 wings, which are the serpent gods and or dragons. And so the kings and the queens, and particularly in places like Sumeria, are depicted and actually called serpents because they look just like their procreators. And so they had this serpentine face. So if you can imagine again that long elongated skull that has on the face a protruding chin, very, very high, narrow cheekbones, very, very large wraparound eyes that glowed and would light up a room. If people have seen the Stargate series with the Goa'uld, and when they speak, their voices bellow and their eyes glow, that's sort of like building on that mythos as to what the serpentine giants looked like. But there were other gods and other angels that had a different look. So you can imagine a god like Nergal, who was a lion god, and or Mahis or Sekhmet or Bast in the Egyptian pantheon, and there's Shima in the Indian pantheon, producing offspring that looked like them as well. So you get these beings that show up in the Bible called the lion men of Moab, or the lion-like men of Gad, or Arioch, the king of the kings of the east in the War of Giants in Genesis 14, that also means lion-like by his name. And then you get these lion-like warriors that are depicted in Sumerian mythology, Egyptian mythology, and all around the world. Then they were not typically the kings, but they were a warrior class. So they were mostly amongst the armies and used as mercenary warriors. You also get these Tengu gods that show up in India and China and Southeast Asia that had these bird faces, and they produced offspring that were called the Tengu. And in the Quiché Maya, they produced the Zilbalba and the House of Camazotz. And if somebody Googles Camazotz, you're going to see a picture that shows up that looks like a Batman outfit and mask, because the Camazotz was the house of the Bat people in terms of those demigods. And so they would have come from these bird-like gods, whether or not it is like Horus, who is a falcon god. And typically these bird gods were understood as having one of 4 faces when they took a physical form, and it was typically that eagle head, and that was the cherubim and that were in the Bible, and one of those faces is an eagle. And
Gary, pardon the interruption. We've got to take another time out. We'll come back and pick up on that point. Gary Wayne, the Genesis 6 conspiracy, right here on the Conspiracy Show. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm hard at work on another edition of Inner Sanctum, my free monthly newsletter. Inner Sanctum features my monthly brief, a column of my thoughts and opinions on what's happening in the world. It features a spotlight on a past guest, a look ahead to an upcoming episode of my weekly syndicated radio program, The Conspiracy Show. It features a look at this month in conspiracy and UFO history, and my Conspiracy Unlimited podcast episode pick of the month, and so much more. To get your free monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum, delivered to your email inbox, just go to my website, strangeplanet.ca, strangeplanet.ca. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on Inner Sanctum and register. It's fast, easy, and again, absolutely free.
Leave everything you know behind on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
All right, Gary, you were just describing some of these strange iterations, I guess, of the Nephilim, and some of these correspond with images from ancient Egypt. What about jackals? What about we often see these depictions in Egyptian hieroglyphics of half human, half jackal, or
so the parent god Anubis was the jackal god, and a marker of a dog, so to speak, in that classification. And he produced offspring as well. And they lived in a massive city called Sinopolis. Dog City is how we would sort of translate that. And this is the root for the dogmen, but really dog Nephilim. And again, mythos, and they were all warriors. And again, you get these dog Nephilim, whether all around the world, whether or not it's in Greek mythology or in the subcontinent of India or over into China. This is a common sort of understanding. And biblically, you have one of the Rephaim tribes, the Avim, that are worshiping a god named Nebaz, who is the barking god, and he's a god that would be akin to Anubis. So I think those gods would be the root for the dog people, or the dog men, or the dog Nephilim, as I would like to call them. And just as you have the Anunnaki that are represented with wings as being those eagle gods that would have produced those bird Nephilim, that and if somebody wants to Google Tengu, you'll get some images on these creatures that are absolutely astounding, because they were, again, warriors and priests of the Tengu. The dog Nephilim were warriors. I have documents that I make available to people if they get a hold of me at my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com. I have a 3-part series on the dogmen. I have one on the lion men. I have one on the serpent Nephilim, and I also have one on the lion men. So on each of those, I have a link to a Facebook publication where I have pictures of engravings of these and reliefs of these types of Nephilim, and they are absolutely astounding to look at. So if people are interested in that, just get a hold of me and I'll send you the document with the link with those pictures. And getting back to the serpentine ones, who are the offspring of the seraphim angels. They were the ruling class in terms of the kings for the most part. And over 1,000 years after the flood, you have a king of the Amarna dynasty named Akhenaten, and he's the father of King Tut. And if anybody has ever been to one of those traveling museums, or if you want to Google Akhenaten, you'll bring up that picture. And when I was describing that protruded chin and that high cheekbone and those large wraparound eyes and that elongated skull, that's Akhenaten's head. That's a serpentine look, diluted over 1,000 years after the flood. And so going back to the comment that you had made earlier, and what we had talked about, is that these bloodlines were being diluted. So they were losing those features over time, and they were losing their size over time. But there were many different kinds of Nephilim and Rephaim, and I think they were recreated again after the flood in all of those different varieties as well, because we get so many post-Diluvian accounts of them as well. So you have ones before and ones after. And it's absolutely frightening to think that this was commonplace. And the dog Nephilim, they are being depicted and described by historians and in Eastern Orthodox religion accounts all the way, and some into the Roman accounts as well, up to 1000 AD and maybe even a little bit beyond. So there is an incredible amount of source that's in secular history actually accounting for these beings. It's crazy.
What about Bigfoot in North America, Sasquatch, or the Yeti in the Asian continent? Is there a connection, do you suppose, between these creatures and the Nephilim?
I think there is. I don't think they're Nephilim or Rephaim, but they are sort of under that umbrella, as I would call it, of Nephilim type of creations. So typically you have the Bigfoot. They're larger, a little larger than humans, but not as big as the Nephilim. But they're hairy, just as the Nephilim were hairy. Their eyes kind of glow. They communicate. They're associated with caves, are associated with the little people, which is again another type of creation that seemed to happen both before and again after the flood, and associated with portals as well. And there are gods in the Indian pantheons that sort of are like ape-like, and so one presumes that at least coming out of the polytheist accounts is that the gods would typically copulate to create these types of beings. So one would presume that they were either after taking the characteristics of an animal or of the god. And I would lean towards the god than copulation with an animal to create these types of beings, and again to sort of take after the looks of their procreator. So there's a definite connection there between the Bigfoot and the Yeti and the Sasquatch and all the different names, and like the Nephilim, and like the little people, and like the pyramids, and like the flood, these accounts are part of a common history that is recorded in all cultures on all continents around the world. And they have the same similar descriptions and accounts of these beings all around the world. So there's a relationship there that we just haven't quite fully put together. But in the early post-Diluvian world, and very much so in the antediluvian world, that was all of these different creations were part of the ruling organizational structure that reported to the demigod Nephilim and to the gods that were governing the earth, the Watchers, also known as the Anunnaki.
Is there a marker, a gene, I don't know, a protein that can be linked back to the Nephilim? And at this point in human history, do we all carry that gene or that marker?
Well, certainly it would be dispensed throughout a significant part of the world. What they call this gene in the mythos and in the occult polytheist religions is the gene of Isis, and the same sort of root that Genesis comes from. And of course, Isis is the offspring, mother goddess, wife of Osiris. And the idea here is that there's a gene that is common to the mother goddess that is sort of the allegory for the root of all things being created. And that there is a gene that is out there that identifies the people of those genealogies where, again, gene comes from, right, in terms of the genealogy being a derivative of gene. And that this is the gene that they're looking for. And the gene would produce the blood of the Nephilim. And when you get into the bloodline of Rh negative with the 4 types, we find that there's about 15% of the population that has Rh negative blood. And people sort of get confused as to, well, it can't be bloodlines of the Nephilim because it's Rh negative, it's missing the antigen, and that's why it's negative. And then you can't add something if something's missing, but it's the gene that produces the blood and starts to answer the questions as to why Rh doesn't always continue to show up in each generation. But the point of the matter here is that it's a manifestation of that gene. And it's also called in polytheism in the secret societies, the spark of the divine. And so when you hear people talking about 1,000 points of light, that's the spark of the divine, that's the gene, and that's the bloodline that they're trying to fully unite for bringing about the new age and the new world that they want to bring about.
All right, we're heading into the top of the hour. When we come back, we'll get into the connection between giants and secret societies, and we'll also take your questions. We can do it over the phone at 416-360-0740, 416-360-0740 in the Greater Toronto area, toll free from just about anywhere, 866-740-4740, 866-740-4740, and we'll also take questions from the live chat. Back with more with Gary Wayne, the author of Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Sit tight.
Live from Toronto, Canada, Earth, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett on Zoomer Radio.
Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Gary Wayne stays with us as we continue to discuss giants, and the book is The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Genesis6conspiracy.com. Excuse me, the website. Use the numeral 6, Genesis6conspiracy.com. So what was the end game, or what is the end game with the creation of Nephilim and their descendants and the giants and so forth? Was it to corrupt the bloodline, forestall the birth of Christ by corrupting the line of Judah?
Yeah, I certainly think that was a later tactic that was employed after the flood as to how to prevent the pure bloodline of the Messiah coming forward. But it starts before that they're really trying to do, and why they're created by the gods and the fallen angels, is that they want to have them usurp control over the kingships and over the religions, and to lead people away from the God of the Bible, the omnipotent God, and to worship them, and to have them, by doing so, not reach their destiny to be raised up like angels, to actually judge angels for the crimes against humanity and for all the crimes against creation that they did in the physical world. So the plan of the demigods was to take over the leadership and parade them into destruction. And of course, the flood comes along, and the world starts anew, but the giants are there as well. So that's when you start to look at how are they going to corrupt that Messianic line. Before the flood, it says that just before the flood, the whole earth was corrupted. And that's more than just the violence and the godlessness that is being talked about in those verses. It is the utter sort of destruction of the and counterfeiting and manipulating of the DNA and the plant genome. So the word corrupt is the Hebrew word chakath, and that means to decay, to degrade, to ruin, to destroy, so that the whole world was corrupt. The whole genomes of the plants and the animals and the humans were corrupt, and that's why you have a start anew with Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. And that is also why God calls the angels, or not the angels, but the animals, to the ark, because he knows which ones haven't been corrupted, and he calls ones that represent each kind or each species. It wasn't of every type of every species. It was the ideal one that was able to repopulate the earth after the flood. And so after the flood, you get Israel being born as part of the resolution plan to the angelic rebellion. And so the fallen angels and their demigod rulers, the Rephaim, after the flood, are going to try to ensure that that never happens. And so they squat into and settle into the covenant land, the land of Canaan, and wait for this birthing nation of Israel that descends down through Abraham, is brought to a nation in Egypt, and then Exodus is back to the covenant land, is now going to enter into this land to take that land back, to have that as a place for the Israelite people and the temple, and to bring on the Messiah down the road. Now, the angels obviously knew about the Messiah as being part of the resolution, and they're going to try and usurp that. They're either going to try and wipe Israel from the face of the earth, and so the Amalekites that we talked about earlier, from Timnah and Amalek, from Eliphaz and Esau's, would inherit the birthright of Jacob, or they would just usurp it with their own dragon Messiah. But typically, they wanted to use Esau's bloodline to usurp it, and that's why you have the Battle of Rephidim right at the time of Israel leaving the Exodus, to try and make that happen, to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. After that, all of the giant nations are trying to do that to prevent Israel even having a chance to produce the bloodline. But after that, then they want to intermarry to try and corrupt that bloodline. And so sort of taint the bloodline or usurp it through their own sort of genealogy. And so they're competing to present their dragon Messiah versus the Messiah of Israel, as to which one's going to come along and sort of accept and resolve this whole conflict that's been going on throughout the generations. What happens, though, is that the angels don't understand what Jesus is coming to do, and he's there to atone for the world's sins and is going to resurrect. They didn't anticipate the resurrection. And the book of Corinthians actually says, had they understood the resurrection would follow, they would never have had Jesus crucified. So it was something that they had no idea that was the true resolution to how they're going to end the angelic rebellion, through the resolution at the end time and the resurrection of humankind to be like angels. So yes, they have been trying all along to do that, and then they're going to try and counterfeit that in the end time.
Going back to David, because Jesus comes from the line of David. When Goliath is squaring off against this young shepherd boy, is Goliath cognizant of the fact that if he is successful and kills this shepherd boy, it's all over? I mean, they win, right? Because Jesus comes from the line of David.
He does, and David has already been selected to replace Saul. And so, yes, I think Goliath was quite happy that it was David who showed up. Now, whether or not they knew that, I'm sure they did, but we're not told that scripturally. But they would have been well versed in the politics of what was going on in Israel with the spies that they would have had in the land. So one presumes that they had some sort of idea. And what's also interesting about the Goliath account is he's laughing at David as he's approaching, and David has picked up 5 smooth stones to try and take down Goliath, but he didn't think he was going to miss. As to why he took 5 stones, he knew that Goliath was either the head warrior, but likely the king of Gath, and the other 4 cities of the Pentapolis of the Philistines were there as well, and they would have been giants as well. So David was prepared to kill all 5 giants, the kings of the 5-city Pentapolis, that day if he had to. But only one was required, and then he took his head. So yeah, I think Goliath and the Philistines knew all along that the monarchy was going to present the Messiah from the bloodlines of the monarchy, and that David was going to be the one who was going to replace Saul, because Saul had not followed all of the orders in terms of the destruction, the complete destruction of the Amalekites for their sins against Israel that dates back to that war of Rephidim that we talked about in the time of the Exodus. So I think that's a very plausible understanding that that Goliath would have had at that time, that this is a TSN turning point, so to speak. That if I kill David, I mean, it really upends everything for what has been planned.
Is it true that when a giant was killed or a Nephilim was killed, that it created a demon?
Yes. So when we look at that word Rapha, which is the root word for Rephaim, and Rapha is singular, there are three words that are connected together, and they root back to 7495, which is Rapha, which can mean a doctor and a healer. And then the offshoot of that is the root word is giant, which is 7497. And then 7496 is a demon spirit and a shade, or a shay as it's also understood, and a spirit. And so the understanding is this, in terms of the connection of the words, is that the Rephaim and the Nephilim were thought to have some sort of special healing capabilities, and the only way to kill them was to take the head. So a blow that would just instantly make it irreparable. And whether or not that was through something in the body or through the sarcophagus that they could regenerate in, it's hard to know, but both were important to them in terms of the sarcophagus. That's part of the giant legacy and part of the king's history, and also this legendary ability to heal themselves from the wound somehow, some way. And of course, the root word for the demon spirit and for the giant. And what happens in terms of the creation of the giants is that they're receiving the immortal spirit of the fallen angel, of the god, and that this spirit cannot die, but it's a counterfeit spirit. And the body is going to die. It's part of the physical world. And in Genesis 6:3, in the creation story of the giants, that's where God steps in and says physical life is not going to extend past 120 years after the descendants die out after the flood, because you've got Noah, who is obviously born before the flood, and all of his sons and the wives, and they're still going to live the longer lives. But the time of Moses, who actually dies at 120 years, you actually have that sort of established as that's the length of period. But the immortal spirit doesn't go to sleep like humans do, as recorded biblically over and over and over, that we go to sleep, and that's why we have a resurrection when we will be awakened. But the immortal spirit of the Rephaim doesn't go to sleep, and the Nephilim doesn't go to sleep, and it's not allowed into heaven. So it's either going to go to a couple of places. It's either going to roam the earth, or it's going to find its way into the underworld, or it's going to be sent to the abyss, where the fallen angels were sentenced to. And we understand biblically that you've got Rephaim and Nephilim spirits along the sides of the abyss in the cells from Ezekiel 32, where they're speaking to, in Ezekiel 32, to the Pharaoh, who's a Rephaim, and are encouraging them and carrying on this prophetic conversation that's going on in that chapter. And so those are the terrible ones, the ones who did terrible things to humans while they were on earth and were slain. So we understand that's the spirit that went in there. So there's a direct connection to the word demon, to the giants through Repha and Rephaim, and to what we see in the world today as the roaming spirits. And why in the secret societies and in the royal Masonic societies of the bloodlines is that they were taught the rituals and the knowledge to find their way after death, so that they wouldn't end up in the cell along the abyss and not roaming the earth, but into the underworld, where at least they are not thirsting for a body and trying to interact with the world. And these are the same demon spirits that Jesus ran across that were possessing people. The most famous one is Legion, and they thirst and need a place for rest, because just roaming the earth is very tiresome and lonesome. And so the only way they can do that is through possession. The word devil in the New Testament, when it's talking about these accounts, goes back to the Greek word daemon for demon. Not to be confused with the devil that's written and translated in the English language that comes from diablos, which is specifically used for references to Satan. And it's unfortunate that the translators, particularly in the King James Version Bible, uses devil for both there, because they should have been more specific with demon.
All right, so secret societies and giants. You sort of alluded to it there, but so are the secret societies made up? I mean, inclusion in a secret society. Do you have to have, that gene, that Nephilim gene, to be included?
I think so. And here's how I get there, is that even with the lowest level secret society of any consequence is Freemasonry. And it's that sort of the bottom level of the tree trunk, where the adept level is 3rd degree on the York Rite or 33rd degree on the Scottish Rite. But there are many, many degrees above that. You have to be invited to join Freemasonry. And at the lower levels, where you're not an adept, and you're not an adept until you're full 3rd degree York or full 33rd degree Scottish Rite, they are told misinformation and only parts of the information, and that the only qualification is you need to be invited and you have to believe in a God of some sort, right? And they're going to get all their answers, at least from a lower societal level of adepts at the 33rd degree and the 3rd degree. You're going to start getting the truer answers, but not all of them, because there's obviously a lot more degrees. So with that thought in mind, if we look at how secret societies begin, it begins before the flood, and it reconstitutes itself again after the flood. And the secret societies are formed from the formation of the 7 sciences that were taught as a sort of bulk knowledge to Adam, passed on to Cain, passed on to his first son Enoch, not to be confused with Enoch, son of Jared. There's 2 Enochs in the 2 separate genealogies. This is Enoch, son of Cain, and he develops this knowledge into 7 separate sciences that are understood as the 7 liberal arts today. And that's the knowledge that merges with the knowledge of the gods that created civilization and writing and everything else. So you also have, with the development of that, the offspring of mysticism and Enochian mysticism, which is the sun bull cult of the antediluvian epoch, and the mystery schools to develop those sciences, which is the offshoot and start of the secret societies. So this is all at the nobility, the elite class, the larger family of the Nephilim kings and warriors, and the priests that are also of those same bloodlines. And so this knowledge then crosses the flood. And according to Freemasonry and the history of Freemasonry, as it's recorded, it's either the location to the bank of knowledge that they store in 36,525 books under the pyramids that they take credit for building with the knowledge developed by Enoch, son of Cain, are put on 2 pillars. One that is able to survive an apocalypse by water, so it floats, and one that could survive an apocalypse of fire. And they put that information on about the religion, about the sciences, and the location that it's located under the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And a fellow named Hermes collects that information because he finds the pillar that survived, the one that floated, and brings that information back to Nimrod, and they start applying that knowledge to build Babel City, Babel Tower, and that we're told biblically that acting as one people with one language, nothing they attempt to do will be prevented from them doing, and then you get the dispersion. But what's important is that this knowledge is shared with Nimrod, who then initiates over 1,000 Masons to start doing this building, and he writes the first constitution for the Masons after the flood. So he is the first Grand Master after the flood. He is starting a royal dynasty as the king of Babel, and thereafter when he stays in Shinar, which is Sumer. And you also have the royal patriarchs of Tubal-Cain, part of Freemasonry and Rosicrucians and secret societies, Jubal, and Lamech, which are all of the lineage of Cain, of course. Enoch is sort of the superstar patriarch to the secret societies. And so if you understand that secret societies at the upper level of this tree that I've used for an allegory to describe their hierarchy, that's the Royal Masons. That's the ancient Masons. And so they operate at the top level of these secret organizations, and the lower level of the bloodlines are at the bottom. So again, I use that as sort of how I get there, that they have to be invited into Freemasonry, and therefore they're typically from people who have been Freemasons and part of secret societies and part of the elite previously, and that they would at least have some sort of genealogy and or bloodline and or gene to be invited. But the higher you go up, and the major intersection along the tree trunk is the Rosicrucians, which is 50% pure blood at the top, and then 50% of rising lower level stock of the other secret societies through the Freemasons, through the Illuminati, and then above the Rosicrucians are the Royal Masonic organizations.
Nimrod, we're just about heading into a break here, so I'll ask this question and then we can pick it up on the other side. But Nimrod, who you just mentioned, if he's involved in the secret societies, then it would follow that he is a descendant of the Nephilim. But Nimrod is also, I believe, the great-grandson of Noah. Now, Noah's family were supposed to be purebloods. So is it possible that that's not the case, that someone on the ark, in fact, was descendant of or had Nephilim blood? We'll get to that answer on the other side. Gary Wayne stays with us. The Genesis 6 conspiracy. Stay with us.
Fasten your seatbelt and put your tray in the upright. Evidence and letting you draw your own conclusions. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the website. Use the numeral 6. Genesis6conspiracy.com. Gary Wayne is with us. So Nimrod, was he a giant or a descendant of giants?
Yeah, you posed a couple of good scenarios there just before the break, and let's start with Nimrod and work our way back. So we do know he's the son of Cush, and he is obviously does not have a male fallen angel for a father, because we know Cush is direct descendant of Noah, as you mentioned. But what we are told is he became a mighty one, which is the Hebrew word Gibor and Gibborim in plural. And Gibborim can be used to describe a giant, or it can be used to describe strength or being strong, and it's used to describe angels. It's used to describe the power of God, and used to describe men. It's not always used for Rephaim or Nephilim. So you have to be careful in terms of when it says mighty one and when that word is used, and how does that fit the narrative that it is in. But it's that word became that's really interesting. And as you take that back, you learn that he broke an oath, he violated something. So I think he was probably somehow changed or transformed somehow with some of the knowledge that he was learned, and he certainly had a strut like a giant. The Freemasons don't really look at him as a giant, though. In their history, he was large, he was strong, he gained his reputation on the giants, yes, but they look at him more as somebody who improved himself, let's say, with the knowledge that he had inherited from Hermes from before the flood. You were mentioning, did a giant Was he included on the ark? From a biblical perspective, we're not told that. All we're told is the 8. But the Gnostics also believe, and there's many versions in the Gnostic versions of the flood, that Noah was a giant, or some of the sons were giant, like Ham, or all 3 were giants, or all the people on the ark were giants. And then there's other versions, particularly coming out of Jewish legend and mysticism, where you have either Tubal-Cain or Og, who are hanging on to the ark during the flood, and Noah feeds them out of empathy and lets them survive into the New World, and that's why he's called the last of the Rephaim, although we don't get that as being biblically. And Rephaim, as I said, there's a distinction between that and the Nephilim. So I think Og is the last of the creation of the giants after the flood, as opposed to a survivor. But we have to be open to the fact that giants could survive the flood, because we're not exactly told how they survived the flood in the Bible. And what's interesting is, which a lot of people will use as a comparative for the Genesis flood story, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Gilgamesh, who is a giant that seems to be 6 generations, so 3 generations after Nimrod, but he's like 19 feet tall. He's 11 cubits tall, and he's the king of Uruk. And he is as wide as Og's bed, so he's 6 to 7 feet wide. I mean, just an absolute monster. But there's also a Gilgamesh that's talked about before the flood in the Book of Giants, and I think Gilgamesh is named after that giant, which is common and it's sort of patronymic, and you see that all throughout those kinds of names after the flood. Patronymic names coming from giants, like Magog, as a descendant of Japheth. Magog was an offspring of Iapetus, who also produced Gog, and Albion as giants before the flood. So that's a common thing that happens, is my point. But you have with the idea that Gilgamesh is writing this, is the main character in it, but he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and he's created after the flood, as Enkidu is, and he's 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And he tells the flood story in about tablet 10, beginning tablet 10, that includes an individual called Utnapishtim, who is also 1/3 human and 2/3 God. And he's the archetypical Nephilim, and his whole family is Nephilim. So you get in the Epic of Gilgamesh a second incursion and a giant survival story. And so we have to be sort of open to that possibility that somehow giants survived the flood, not necessarily on the ark that Noah is on, because that's clearly biblically a human survival story. But certainly you have many accounts of giants surviving the flood on the ark, as in Deucalion and Pyrrha in the Greek mythology, because Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, so he's Nephilim as well. And they become like the Greek Noah, but again, it's a giant survival story. So when you look at the flood stories and the survival stories of the flood, you get 2 accounts all around the world. You get a human survival, and you also get a giant survival. So because we're not told explicitly in the Bible how they show up after the flood, we have to be open to the idea that somehow they survived the flood. But typically I fall on second incursion, because it just seems to fit better with the details.
All right, let's go to the YouTube live chat, and here are some questions for you, Gary. Mirais P asks, are Nephilim descendants alive today, and who are they? Are there 14 bloodlines? And did these fallen angels create mermaids, unicorns, centaurs, griffins, even possibly dinosaurs, as they tried to play God by mixing DNA? All right, so 3 questions there. Nephilim descendants alive today, and who are they?
Yeah, I think they are. I think we have the descendants in the royal families, and they've continued all down through the generations from after the flood of intermarriage as much as they could. And, in First World War, you basically had family civil war, because they were all cousins, and they continue to intermarriage as much as they can. And where you fit in the royal Masonic secret societies and the royal families is, in terms of your hierarchy, is the purity of that bloodline that's kept in genealogies that go back into the mists of time, and how you've scioned or grafted in other ennobled bloodlines. So like the Merovingians, for example, were the most ennobled bloodline to that time, with all of the scioning of other pure bloodlines into their royal bloodlines, complete with the genealogies that they said they had. And the Stuart dynasty, the Stuart dynasty, the Unicorn dynasty, was the most ennobled dynasty to that point. So these are the descendants of the giants. And when you hear particularly the Stuart dynasty, the Unicorn dynasty, that they have a divine right to rule, that divine right comes from after the flood, from the Baalim of Mount Hermon, the Council of the Gods that's recorded in Psalm 82, that rule over the 70 nations that's talked about in Deuteronomy 32, that are ruling as what they would believe superior beings. So when you look at the word royale, if you look at the N suffix on it, al, that's actually from a legitimate original word, which is el in Hebrew for an angel or a god, and Roy is a king. They call themselves the kings of God, or Rex Deus, or the black nobility. They have a lot of different sort of allegories for their name, but that understanding that they believe that they descend from the gods, and which gives them the right to rule, is something we need to all keep in mind, because they control everything from the secret society level through the Royal Masonic orders. And so typically the 13 families that people talk about aren't the 13 families of the world. There could be 13 families of the world. Hard to get information on that, but the 13 families that most people look at are the 13 European families, and the American bloodlines that are intermarrying with those bloodlines would be called the pseudo blue bloods, that they're trying to ennoble through generations to position themselves higher up in the hierarchy of who runs the world through their children intermarrying and continuing to intermarry and scioning in.
Okay.
So the 13 families would be at the top of the Western secret societies, but understand there's bloodlines and secret societies all over the world. Some say there's 13 families that run the whole world, that some are sort of extend out of the 13 families of Europe.
Got it. Okay. And did these fallen angels create mermaids, unicorns, centaurs, griffins, even possibly dinosaurs, as they tried to play God by mixing DNA?
Yes, they did. Again, whether or not it was through copulation or scientific knowledge or a combination of both. The centaurs are actually created in a cloud, as is Amaka Seth in the Gnostic religion, which is a precursor race of giants to the giants created in Genesis 6, according to the Gnostics, also created in a cloud. So that sort of implies, above the earth, in some sort of laboratory and some sort of DNA manipulation. And when we look at the technology that we're just catching up to now, and we're not there yet with what they had in the antediluvian times, because the end time is going to be like the days of Noah. We're just starting to get into DNA manipulation now, and to the level of technology that I think they had before the flood. And with all of those different types of creations that you're talking about, that are talked about through polytheism, those would be examples. And the best example of DNA manipulation would be the chimera, which is used today for the same type of technology that's being applied. And King Habada, out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, would be your perfect example as a Nephilim chimera, with all the different parts of animals that he would have had that likely had to be done through DNA manipulation.
All right, another timeout awaits. Back on the other side with more questions from the YouTube live chat. Gary Wayne stays with us. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Back with more in a moment.
The owners of the system take a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
All right, we're back with Gary Wayne. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis6conspiracy.com. Gary, any plans for a revised edition, and what else are you working on these days?
Yeah, I have 2 books on the go. The first one that's going to come out, I've set the other book aside. It's an end time prophecy book on the second Exodus. I said I would never write a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy because I didn't want to be redundant, but hearing from so many people over the last number of years, I've decided to do the sequel. It should be out by the midpoint of next year, hopefully the end of the first quarter, but that's might be a little bit tight on the guideline. And it's going to go in such detail of additional information that people have been sort of asking for as to how much is said about giants and angelology in the Bible, and how does prehistory connect to the end time. So it's going to be called Prehistory and Prophecy, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, and I'm hoping to have it out before the midpoint of next year.
Fantastic. All right. Highly anticipated for sure. Let's see. Thinker asks, how does the evolution of Lilith and the bloodline of Satan unfold in today's society?
Yeah, that's another good question, because Lilith is kind of part of the key allegory of the matriarchal bloodlines of the giants. And so you have patriarchal, which is usually utilized in an allegory of the dragon. And so when you have like Pendragon, as an Uther Pendragon, that's a common sort of understanding. The matriarchal bloodline is the fairy or the owl, and the patriarchal is the dragon or the raven. And Lilith is sort of typically understood as an owl type of imagery, and she is the offspring of Tiamat, which is a serpentine god, female goddess, and creator of all sorts of these creatures that the last person was asking about from the Sumerian pantheon. Bast would be a similar one, but that was a lion god out of the Egyptian god, and of course the god that shows up in the Black Panther because it's a lion god. So makes kind of sense when you look at it. But when you look at what is going on with Lilith is that she has, out of Sumerian mythology, she has a daughter named Lula Lilith that is going to marry, in the mystical Jewish rendition as it mixes in with Sumerian traditions, is going to marry Cain. And Lilith is also a consort of Adam in that Gnostic and mystical Jewish sort of understanding of the time of Adam and Eve. So you have Lilith that is obviously at least a demigod and maybe an offspring god, and is also producing offspring, and is used as a significant part of the allegory of the fairy matriarchal and owl matriarchal bloodline. And what's interesting about how they started new dynasties is they had to have a super pure blood female queen to start a new dynasty with a prince of the dragon bloodline. So understanding Lilith's connection and allegory, as well as Tiamat in the allegories of the bloodlines, is very, very important if you're going to be able to understand the writings of the elites in terms of how they embed things. So it comes together, as a quick example, because I know I'm going on for a long time on the answer here, but if you go to Uther Pendragon, whose son was King Arthur, they were Tuatha De Danann. They were, again, those giants that we're talking about, and he's representing the dragon bloodline. And the fairy queen of the Tuatha De Danann, and the Tuatha De Danann are the fairy people, is Guinevere. So you get that coming together as that allegory of the bloodlines and that Camelot marriage that is so famous in the Arthur tales and the Grail tales.
All right. We just got about 3 minutes here before the next break. Andrew Boyle asking Gary if you know of the giant killed in Iraq during the American occupation around 2003. I'm not sure if that's. There's a story of a giant that was, I believe, killed in Kandahar in Afghanistan. I don't know if we're talking about the same.
Yeah, that's the same accounting as my recollection is, and it was on Coast to Coast with Steve Quayle, and I actually listened to that at one point in time, and I was absolutely fascinated by the accuracy to the detail that was being delivered on the interview in terms of what the giants looked like and how hard they were to kill and how fleet of foot and how fast, how they smelled, the size, everything was so very, very similar to the details that I had assembled as to what they would have looked like and how they would have acted, that if it was a hoax, then it was information supplied by people who understood Nephilim inside and out.
Fascinating. How would these giants just suddenly, pop up without, significant breeding pairs and so forth? Why aren't there more giants seen running around? If there were two, there must be more.
That gets to be the obstacle to the story. So the question then is that sort of a recent rendition or something that is released? I mean, there's so much of the mythos that's out there that giants are going to show up in the end time because they've been held in stasis and underground chambers all over the world, in Antarctica and everywhere else. We have so much of that information, or there's been some angels that aren't in the abyss, because only the worst of the angels that fell and the impassioned ones went into the abyss. And we talked about the numbers that would be part of the rebellion. Not all are in there. So as we get closer to the end time, they may start recreating these giants, and maybe they already have. But somehow, some way, we're going to see these giants again in the end time, either through the bloodlines or a recreation or through DNA manipulation, just as the Nazis were trying to do with the new man technology. But somehow, some way, or both, we're going to have a resurgence of the power of either the descendants and or both with the giants. And I look at Daniel 2's prophecy in verse 43 in the metallic dynasties.
Gary, let me just jump in here. Pardon the interruption. We'll pick up on that point. Daniel 2, you said. We'll continue this with Gary Wayne on the other side as we discuss giants right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
So, Gary, you were talking about Daniel 2, and we were discussing, I guess, the role of giants in the end times and how they will, I guess, they'll have to reemerge in some manner.
Yeah, and Daniel 2:43 is kind of a frightening passage to read, and you need to read it out of the King James Version Bible as opposed to the other translations to get, I guess, the more startling sort of version of it, probably more accurate as you take it back to Hebrew. And so it says that the 10 kings of the end time, which is the end time empire that rises out of the Roman Empire, it says that these 10 kings will commingle and mix their seed with men, which is suggesting some sort of different race of some sort. So either it's the descendants of the giants that consider themselves still a different race and superior to humans, or it's new giants and Rephaim that are going to be there, or there's going to be something else that's going on, because you could also interpret that as you take the meanings of the commingling back to Hebrew, it could mean possession. So it could be that the technology that we're creating, and I'm speculating on this based on that possession and the spirit commingling as in a possession or a avatar effect that angels would use. The technology that we're creating, it could be the bodies that are going to be recreated through clone bodies or transhumanism or whatever that will create this oikotarian, which is the habitation, the dwelling place that a spirit requires in the physical world to interact in the physical world. So there could be those oikotarian bodies being developed with the technology and DNA manipulation and everything that's going on today. So I think that's something, when you look at that, you say, wait a minute, what's going on? Who are these people? And I need to learn maybe a little bit more about them. And when you understand that the beast empires of Babylon, Greece, Persia, and Rome, and the two before, Assyria and Egypt, all are outreaches of the descendants of the Rephaim after the flood. So these beast kingdoms have either the bloodlines and or giants coming back to rule in the last 7 years.
Mike Logue asks, were there any females born among the daughters of men and the giants?
Yes, as in giant females. Yes, there were. And in Greek mythology, they're known as the Titanides. And so when you have King Oberon, who's in Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's writing that polytheist history and encoding those characters, and Oberon goes back to Scythians as an overlord, and Uberon and Overane and all of those sort of words through the etymology. He's the king of the fairies, and his wife's name is Titania, which is, you know, a female derivative off of Titan. In after the flood, we actually get one account biblically, as I talked about earlier, was the offspring Amalek, who creates the hybrid race. Is the mother there is Timnah, who is descended from Seir, which is basically in Hebrew the same word as Satir, a degraded seraphim angel, degraded watcher. She is a female giant after the flood that marries Eliphaz to produce Amalek, and the elven bloodline, or the fairy bloodline, as you take Duke, as they're called, the Dukes of Edom, back to the Hebrew word, which is Aleph, and that's the allegory that the polytheists use for the elven fairy bloodline.
The alien abduction phenomenon, is that somehow, I've done many shows on this, but I'd be interested in your take, connected to, as in the days of Noah? So we, in the days of Noah and before, there was this human fallen angel hybrid program going on. Some accounts of the alien abduction phenomena seem to point to some sort of alien human hybrid program going on. Are they connected? Are they related?
Oh, yeah, I think they're related, and it's also connected to fairies, and then there's different classification of fairies, and that includes the elementals, which are the little people, although the salamanders are the fourth classification and part of the reptilians of that alien mythos. Where I'm going quickly on this is that fairies have been with us all through our history as legend, but they have a legend of coming through fairy mounds with flying machines and kidnapping people and doing sexual experimentations on them to try and help regenerate their bloodline, because they too have a difficulty in reproducing and keeping their genes pure from disease. And these people are called the gray neighbors, and they're part of the gnome classification in the little people of the ugly ones. And they looked after the technology and the genealogies and the knowledge of the demigods and the fallen angels in the physical world. And I put a couple of examples of a fairy abduction in the Genesis 6 conspiracy book, that if you didn't know it was a fairy doing the abducting, you would swear it was a gray alien, because they look identical. And so the alien mythos, I think, is all interconnected with the types of beings that the angels created, as being recreated after the flood again, and working through portals and into different dimensions, because most of the aliens sort of come through portals and things, right? Just as the fairies do, just as the Rephaim did, and just as the gods did and do. And I think all of the different creatures that we're going to see in the alien mythos are going to be used as sort of the story, the cover story for all of these beings that were created by the fallen angels after the flood, just as they created them before the flood, as violations against the laws of creation.
So if there is some sort of a hybrid program going on now, is this about raising an army for Satan or the Antichrist?
It's partially about that. It's partially about, to raise that army, you have to raise the level of technology. I mean, our level of technology is increasing exponentially at an unexplainable pace, and it almost seems like we're being fed this knowledge to have us caught up. So roll forward to an army that you're talking about. After the abyss is opened in Revelation 9, And Azazel, Abaddon, Apollyon comes out with the scorpion beings. That's another rabbit hole we won't go down now. You have similar types of beings that but are a little bit different that are in the 200 million man war. And these are the same type of creatures that are just depicted in Joel 1 and 2, and this is the same war as Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog and Magog war of the end time that happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years. And these creatures that are described in Revelation 9 and Joel 1 and 2 seem to be highly advanced technical combination of AI, transhumanism, some sort of cloning, but they are creatures that are designed and created for battle, which is why they seem so unrecognizable.
Wow. Just have a couple minutes here. I was on Coast to Coast last night with Derek Gilbert talking about the second coming of Saturn. And we talked about a year ago now, the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, the reemergence of Saturn as, reigning supreme in the sky, his contention that Saturn is Satan. What do you think of that?
Saturn is typically used as an allegory for Satan, or Azazel. It's actually used for both. So I think when we look at the wandering stars and those 7 planets and stars in the planets, so as we talk about, is that 7 Satans of Satan. Satan is still above that, and so I would look at the coming of the Babylon religion as the pantheon, and then Satan is above that, and Satan rules with Antichrist in the last 3.5 years. So Babylon will show up before the start of the last 7 years, but will be destroyed by Antichrist in the midpoint. So when we look at what is being presented as signs through astrology, we should expect to see more of that, because they're trying to bring this about. They want this rendezvous with destiny. So if you're following that, just take it for note, but also note that there's another side of signs that are going to be coming that aren't astrological. And I wouldn't advise people to follow astrology and astrological signs, but we need to understand that the people who are trying to bring about world government and the 10 King Empire, they believe it. And what they're doing with that belief, which is what we need to be focused on.
Fantastic. Great job, Gary. I learned so much when you come on. And we look forward with great anticipation to the sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy happening or arriving sometime mid-year next year. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been terrific. Genesis6conspiracy.com. Genesis6conspiracy.com.
All right, my thanks to Carlos and Ryan. Don't forget, next week, Boxing Day, there will be a previously enjoyed program from December 26, 2012. Merry Christmas. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite, I'm coming home. Good night.